Today's video is all about arm circles. We're going to be covering arm circles in 3 different positions: standing, sitting, and kneeling. And we're also going to be talking about the various hand positions. Now, if you've been involved with postural therapy for a while, or Peter Egoscue's books, you may remember the golfer's grip. And that was the standard hand position for these exercises for decades. But recently, Pete has changed how this exercise is supposed to be performed. And in the book, he still talks about golfer's grip because he made these changes even just since that book was written. But there are going to be two different hand positions. I like to call them fingers and fists. We'll get into why I call them that. But let's get into starting with the standing arm circles and how that's different than the other 2 positions. Now, let's get into the hand positions we're going to be using. The fingers. When I say fingers, I mean fingers spread as wide as they can go and pulled back like this. And then the second hand position is going to be fists balled as tight as you can. So we're going to be doing these arm circles in each of these with both fingers out and fists balled. So let's see what that looks like. For standing arm circles, you need to start with your feet hip width apart. And we need to make sure that our feet are pointing straight ahead. Now that means that this line between the middle toes is pointing straight ahead. If my big toes are pointing straight ahead, my feet are actually slightly everted. So it's going to feel, if you have everted feet, this is going to feel like you are actually a bit pigeon-toed, but it is actually right to have your big toes angled in just a little bit. After that, we want to make sure we're standing up tall, and we're going to put the arms out to the side, and we're going to tuck those shoulder blades down and together. So if you imagine 2 arrows pointing down and together, like a triangle going together, like an upside down triangle, then that is what we want those shoulder blades to do. It's going to be very easy, if you're not paying attention, to let that shoulder blade position falter if you're not paying if you lose focus. But we want to make sure that we hold them together. And you'll be able to see in the video if I don't keep them together. Like, okay, this is the motion right here. It's pretty simple. I've got the fingers out, splayed as far as I can, and I'm going in about the diameter of a dinner plate. So almost a foot diameter or so. But here's the shoulder blades tucked. And look, you saw my shoulders raise. That's because I just let those shoulder blades become untucked. So we're keeping them tucked and going in like a medium pace circle here. And we are trying not to let the head and the upper body do all kinds of wobbling. We're trying to keep them still. It's basically as fast as I can go without letting the upper body begin to wobble front and back. And you would do typically 20 to 40 repetitions in that position. Then we are going to do our fists balled tightly. So I call it fingers and fists. Same thing, tuck those shoulder blades, and we're going in a forward direction. Now, there's a second part here. We're going to splay those fingers out again, turn the palms up towards the ceiling, maintain that upwards position, tuck those shoulder blades, and now we're going backwards with a similar pace and diameter. And for me, this is where it can get really hard to keep those shoulder blades tucked without making my belly go out or things like that. So this is for me, is even after 3 years of doing it, still tough to keep those shoulder blades tucked, especially when I'm trying to talk and tell you how to do it. So be sure to be mindful of that. You do about 20 to 40 there, and the same thing, we're going to ball those fists, keep them pointed, the palms up towards the ceiling, and do 20 more. So those are standing arm circles. Now we're going to get into sitting arm circles and kneeling arm circles as well. So what's the difference? Well, in this one, we're engaging the whole kinetic chain from the feet, the tips of the toes, all the way up to the shoulders and the head. And we are working on dynamic tension in the body. In other words, the body's ability to maintain this upwards balance, so either being hunched forward or the hips bailed forward, things like that. Standing arm circles is a great exercise for that. When we talk about seated or sitting arm circles, the upper body motion is exactly the same. We're going to have the palms down, the shoulder blades tucked. Start with the palms down, the fingers splayed out wide, going forward, just like the other motion. Then we're going to do the fists here, just like the other motion. We're going to turn back up to the palms, fingers splayed, do that same motion, and then the fists balled, shoulder blades tucked still, doing that same motion. But what's changed is obviously we're sitting. So what's the difference here? Well, in this case, we've eliminated compensations in the entire lower body here. We are no longer focused as much on the dynamic tension of between the, promoting proper dynamic tension between the ankles and the hips. Now we are really looking at focusing on dynamic tension between the hips and the shoulders throughout the spine. So this is much more of a lower back and upper back exercise than what we find when we are just trying to do the standing arm circles. But let's talk about the lower body and also why I have this block here. So just like in the standing arm circles, we want to make sure that we have this line between the middle toes pointed straight ahead, and not the big toes pointing straight ahead. You can see the difference there in the video. It looks subtle, but there's a big difference in terms of how your knees and hips are going to respond here. Now, when we're doing this exercise, you might find that you tend to let your knees splay out. If you're just starting out and you're having a hard time focusing on keeping those knees at hip width, you might need the assistance of a block here, and just squeezing that block to add a degree of strengthening the adductors. And it also is like a mental cue because you're not letting the block drop. So that is a really good modification to make if you find it really hard to not let those knees splay out. Especially bigger guys like me, it's really easy to, when you're focusing on all this stuff in the upper body, all of a sudden those legs just start to kind of abduct out. And that's really not what we're wanting. We're wanting to decrease compensations in the lower body. So there we go, just like this. Palms down, fingers splayed, palms down, fists, palms up, fingers splayed, backwards rotations, and backwards rotations with the fists, just like that. Typically, you're going to be doing 20 to 40 repetitions of this exercise. Finally, we're talking about the most difficult version of arm circles, the kneeling arm circles. Now, it would be nice if we were just doing it in the hero's pose like this, but this is just the starting position. So if you can't do hero's pose, you definitely shouldn't even try to do the kneeling arm circles. But the upper body work is going to be completely the same. What we're doing now is adding a real big component of thigh, glute, and hip and pelvis strengthening and stabilization to this exercise. We're not letting the feet do the work of the knees and the hips here. So we're strengthening all this stuff in between. And the upper body work is exactly the same. So we're going to go up to a kneeling position. And same thing, I've got my fingers splayed, my shoulder blades tucked. I do 20 in this position going forward. Ball up the fists, do 20 going forward. I would then keep the shoulder blades tucked again, palms up, fingers splayed. I do 20 in this position. And then I would ball up the fists, palms toward the ceiling, shoulder blades tucked, 20 going backwards now. So those are the three positions of arm circles. And again, let's review the differences between the three. In kneeling, I'm really working on strengthening the muscles between the hips and the knees, and improving pelvic position, things like that. In the seated position, I'm really working on improving the ability of the spine to handle dynamic tension and reducing or eliminating the work in the lower body. And finally, with the standing arm circles, we're working on dynamic tension from the toes all the way to the head. And that one is, let's rank them real quick in terms of difficulty. I did them in increasing difficulty. The standing arm circles is, for most people, going to be the easiest unless it hurts to stand up. That would be often the case when we go to the sitting arm circles, but even though you're sitting down, the exercise can be a little more strenuous in some ways because you're not letting your feet do any of the work, and your spine, your lower back has to do a lot more of that stabilization. And finally, the hardest one is this kneeling position we just did here. As a bonus, I've got one last kind of modification or thing you can try once you get to the point where arm circles are starting to get really easy. And you can increase the difficulty and add a component of strengthening the forearm by getting some of these guys. These are, I'm not even sure what you call them, but as you can see there, it's a silicone band, resistance band that goes from my wrist and connects to each finger. And when we talk about that finger splayed position, it really adds an extra component of strengthening these forearms, because there aren't any actual muscles in your fingers. Your fingers just have ligaments and tendons and things like that, fascia. So the muscles that do the work for your fingers are all up here in the forearm. And when we do this and have that, oh man, it is really tough. Even on the lightest resistance setting, it is very tough once you have this component of strengthening to this exercise. But I would not recommend starting here just because there is so much to be had from just doing it without it to begin with. But once this becomes easier, once the standard form becomes easier, this is a great way to take it to the next level. I'll be doing a full video review of these hand strengthening things and the various ways that I combine them with some different e-sizes to kind of just bump up the difficulty and really work out all these compensations we get from holding our phones like this all day long with our hands scrunched around the steering wheel, over the keyboard, on the mouse. We're really working on getting rid of those types of compensations here.